This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's oral history program, Living Legends Collection. There is no original date given for this interview. The interview is being conducted by Mr. Raymond Fields and Mrs. Henry S. Johnston. The interviewee is Dr. F. C. Seids, Seids, a dentist in Perry, Oklahoma. This interview is being re-recorded on June the 4th, 1985 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is the Living Legend Library and the home of Dr. J.C.C. Seids, F.C. Seids, in Perry, Oklahoma. Dr. Seids has practiced dentistry in this community for some 68 years. But aside from that, he has also found time to do public service in municipal offices, in the lower house of the Oklahoma legislature, and in many various ways. With us today in the residence of Dr. Seids is Mrs. Henry S. Johnston, the widow of Governor Johnston and a director of the Living Legend Library, and we appreciate Mrs. Johnston's interest in arranging this interview with Dr. Seids. We will just let him tell his own story as he sees fit.
I have some notes here that they deal with
Dr. Seids.
This will get it all right. All right. Born and raised in northwestern Ohio, and having been frozen, I thought every winter I finally found an opportunity to relieve this cold region. I came to Oklahoma at the instance of my brother-in-law and sister, who had moved to Mulhall from Omaha, Nebraska. After making my decision, I planned to come following the opening in 1889. The time was September, it was the middle or latter part of September, and I took a train, the New York Central line, Chicago, and from there I took the Santa Fe, which took me to Mulhall. The engine had the shriekiest whistle I ever heard, and I never will forget the way it carried on down across I thought everything was probably after I left Chicago. As I awakened, as we rolled into Chicago, I was startled at the amount of a big meadow that they were pitching hay. I just couldn't believe it, and I looked and looked, and as my eyes opened, I found I was looking at the old Lake Michigan, and it was rather angry that morning, and it was sowing the hay. This idea and this thought remained with me all the years, because I had never seen a great body of water, and this was amazing to me. I left Chicago on the Santa Fe train, and arrived in Kansas City that evening. And from Kansas City, it didn't seem too long. I got into Omaha about 9 or 10 o'clock, and my sister was there to greet me and her husband, and I put up for the night. I could scarcely wait to get out and see how things looked outside. My impression was that it wasn't such a great change after all, as I found many things that were very common to me. After getting my bearings, I began to take on the merchandising of the Cummings store, and I acquainted myself with the ideas and systems of the owner, and I wish I could put my thumb on that occasionally. Get ready to go. My first introduction, we had just received a carload of flour from the J.P. Baden Company at Winfield, and we were hauling the flour from the car and storing it in the flour room, which was the rear end of the building that the store occupied. There were many introductions of this kind, and I soon began to realize that doing the grocery business was not the easiest thing that I might have taken on. And so I looked around to see about how long it would be before I'd be able to get a job at some lighter work. I was made acquainted with the process of employing my time, and in my spare time we sacked up beans and sugar in various size packages, so we did not need, on the busy days, we could reach under the counter and pull out a sack of beans or sugar or whatever we want. And we had one thing that always impressed me. We received huge boxes of sow belly, which was a very popular food. And it came from the Armor Packing Company at Wichita, and sometimes from others, but more frequently the Armor people supplied the needs in the meat line. There were many things that kept me pretty busy around the store, but the things that I thought most of was getting out and looking at the country. And from time to time I would take off a day, and I would go hunting every Sunday, and I never will forget my first introduction to the country and what I found people doing. Many people were living in dugouts. They would dig into the bank of where there were hills, and put a roof over it and put sod on it, and it would settle down and in a little while shed water. Well, one of the boys' parents lived up the creek. They had homesteaded, and he asked me on Sunday if I wouldn't go out home with him on Sunday. And so I agreed, and he said his folks lived in a dugout, and he wanted me to see the inside and look around a little. And we proceeded up Beaver Creek, and I found where the family lived before I arrived. I saw a lot of bedding and all kinds of household goods hanging in the brush around the place, and as we approached, the family were busy as bees carrying out everything. It had rained the night before, and the new roof had caved in, and everything was covered with mud. Well, they had to depend on the water from the creek to wrench off a lot of the things, and they were hung up in the process. They took them out and hung them up in the brush and laid them on the grass to dry. And that was my introduction. As we went out to the place, I noticed it was nearing the 1st of October, and people were cutting hay. This was a surprise to me, too, for we always made our hay in the early part of the season. But this hay was red, and it was dead grass, about half dead grass, and it created quite an impression, because I never had thought of cutting grass that looked like that for hay. But I found that the stock ate it well, and it was quite a good commodity. And there was a market for it. In due time, I became acquainted with the various parts of the country, and I hunted up and down Beaver Creek, and we had many things that were interesting. And I continued through the winter, and the following spring, along in April or May, my brother-in-law came to me one morning and says, "Get your coat and hat. I want you to go to Stillwater with me." He had a store at Stillwater. His second store was at Stillwater, and so I agreed, and I went over to Stillwater. We drove a team of ponies and a carriage, and we arrived in due time, and I was let out at the store, and my brother-in-law disappeared. I didn't see him again until about 4 o'clock. He had a nephew operating the store, and he had failed to make returns for some time, and things were all messed up, but he was hunting the brother-in-law. About 4 o'clock, he came back to the store, and he says, "I'm going home now," and he says, "I'm going to leave you here in charge of the store." And from that time on, I was a merchant. I employed help and carried on the various parts of the business, and always managed to send the cash to the boss at Mulhall. It was not too long. All of the conversation was about the opening of the Cherokee Strip at that time, and many were making their preparations, and likewise my brother-in-law began to think of having a store at Perry. I was given the opportunity to close out the store at Stillwater, and in due time I had it closed out. And then I returned to Mulhall. during my stay at Stillwater, I became acquainted with many very fine people. My hotel keeper was Mr. Munhall, who had moved to Stillwater from Garden City, Kansas. He was one of the western Kansas people who was compelled to leave there because of the continued drought. And I heard much about the western Kansas situation. Well, there were many other things that interested me, and after I returned, the outlook was terrific for a harvest. My brother-in-law had sold 150-odd vineyards, and I was to go with the man who came, the mechanic, and we drove over the country and set up binders previous to the harvest. And it was not long until I found that what I thought was clerking in a store was not what it was cracked up to be. I thought I would have a glorious time, but not so. I came in one Saturday night and thought I would get a day off for Sunday, but instead, after I had had something to eat and had a bath and had cleaned up, one of the boys came and told me the boss wanted to see me. And so I appeared, and he says, I want you to go out to Jenkins and set up his binder tomorrow, Sunday. Well, I had a big assistant from Wichita. They called him Fatty Rice. Well, Fatty just laughed. It just suited him. And so we hitched up our team and we started for Mr. Jenkins' place. We found a comfortable place and put down some straw and made our bedding there. The next day, Mr. Jenkins informed us that he would rather that we would go and do his neighbor's binder first, that he was superintendent of the Sunday school, and he thought maybe the public would not like the idea of their superintendent having his labor done on Sunday. And so we were sent over to another family by the name of Francis. Well, there were no screens in those days, and the brush seemed scarce, and the old newspapers too for fly chasers. But the flies swarmed. We went over to Francis, and we found the binder and various other things. At noontime, we were called to dinner, and we had boiled beans. And they had been cooked until the beans were tender and mashed up considerably, and among them were heads and wings and legs of flies. My assistant, or my overseer, it just pleased him more than a little. He fished out all the fly legs and to the side of his plate, and because I couldn't do it, he gave me the horse laugh. But I didn't eat any beans. We had white biscuits and butter and some fried pork, sow belly as it was commonly called, and that was our dinner. We completed setting up the binder and moved over to Mr. Jenkins, and where we slept and waited for the morning again, and we proceeded to set up his binder. These were the only two in this community, and so we returned to Mulhall. When we got back to Mulhall, there was some argument about me having carried off the keys. There was a key to everything. Wherever there was a door, there was a lock, and the manager, my brother-in-law, had the one key, and the others were all on a big ring, and we carried them to the door and opened them, and then were supposed to take them back and hang them up. I had all the keys away, and the boys routed him about 4 o'clock in the morning when they came to open the store. And he wasn't very happy about it, and I thought he was going to fire me. And so I told him as I gave the key, turned the keys in, I said, now you can give my job to somebody else. Well, he was somewhat disappointed at my decision. But I made my plans and returned to Ohio. I had met a gentleman who was the station agent at Mulhall. His name was Hitchcock, Ward B. Hitchcock, and quite a fine chap. And he told me if I would take course in pharmacy, he would buy a pharmacy and divide it with me, and I would run it. And accepting this proposition, I returned to Ohio and obtained a job in a drugstore. The drugstore, the laws of Ohio require anyone entering the pharmaceutical college to take 2 years of time. They require 2 years of experience. Well, I worked out the 2 years, and then I was ready to go. But the day I left my job, a man came in to the drugstore and said he would take my job at $1 a day. And I listened for a little bit as he talked to the boss, and the boss said, I'm not going to need any more help. This was just as Grover Cleveland was taking his chair the second time as president. Well, from this time, about the very same day, I received a wire from my brother-in-law asking me if I would consider coming down and closing out the Mulhall store. In the meantime, he had opened quite a business in Perry and had moved his family there, and it was pretty hard to look after the Mulhall store, and he decided to close it out. I hesitated just about 2 minutes, and then I told Mother that I would not continue my pharmacy work, that I was going back to Oklahoma, and that I would earn a little money and speculate on my own education. I returned and took charge of the Mulhall store, and it was quite an institution. We had everything up to a threshing machine, and there were calls for everything one could think of, but we had quite a stock of stuff. And I did a good job closing it out, because every time I found that a man had anywhere near the asked price of an article, I always took the money and let him have it, because I found that in closing out a business, a man should dispose of everything whenever he gets a chance. And I made a very good success of this and was complimented by my competitors and told that I should not take up a profession. In the meantime, I had decided that I would take up dentistry. But I was told that I was the best prospect for a merchant and that I should continue merchandising. Well, it took more money than I had to begin merchandising, and I could see part of the way for my dentistry. So I proceeded, and when the time came, I bought a ticket for St. Louis, where I had corresponded with the I had made arrangements with the dental college at St. Louis and bought my ticket for St. Louis when I was leaving Perry. Or Mulhall rather, I should say. And I had talked with a dentist in Perry who was running a drugstore. He had taken 2 years of dentistry and then decided he wanted to be a pharmacist. So he became a pharmacist and was in a drugstore. He gave me some of his instruments, and we had quite a talk about matters, and he said he wanted me to stop at Kansas City on my way to St. Louis and make the acquaintance of Dr. D.J. McMillan, who was Dean of the Western Dental College at Kansas City. Well, when the time came and I loaded up, I started for St. Louis and stopped over in Kansas City, and I called on Dr. McMillan, and his personality so impressed me that I felt that I should decide on Kansas City instead of going to St. Louis. The boys were coming in, and that class was organizing, and I remained, and before I made my decision, I looked things over. It was not the most wonderful institution. The college was in the upstairs second floor and third floor of the Ziner Battelle hardware store, and things looked rather uninviting. But the men I met who were connected with the college so impressed me that I decided I would remain in Kansas City. And I found a place on Oak Street that looked very good to me, but the boy that was my roommate wasn't satisfied, and he found another place, and we moved. From there, we went over on the west side to Tullis Court. Wasn't very long till one of the boys came and told me that he wanted me to join him in a place out on Camel Street. And of course, I was an amateur in selecting a home, but this place on Camel Street did impress me. And so I moved from Tullis Court on the west side and moved out on Camel Street, and I had been boarding various places, but there was a restaurant on 12th Street that was operated by Ruby Malloy, a red-haired gal that knew all the ins and outs about restaurants, and she insisted that everybody pay cash. She found that the safe way to do business, and so those were the terms, and they were inflexible. Well, many of the boys boarded because they could get more to eat there than any place in the city. She provided them with everything they wanted around there in the way of food, and they were all happy about it. I joined the big crowd that ate with Ruby Malloy and continued to eat there. I always had my money to pay down on pay my advance $10 for a month's board. And my room and board at that time cost me something like 12 and 3, around about $13 a month. The board was $10 a month, and the room was $6 a month for the two of us. Well, we thought that was doing pretty well, and we had a very nice furnished room. It was wonderfully furnished with bath. And things continued. The first month was rather discouraging. There was a debate in my mind going on strenuously whether I would go back to the country or remain. But I thought the second month I would try another month anyway. And I had heard, I could say I've heard it before, because the next month as I heard it, it didn't sound so bad. The lectures to me were impossible. I had never heard so many unnecessary words in my whole life, and it was rather discouraging to think that I had to acquaint my vocabulary with this language. Well, the second year month passed, and the third, and I remained at the college during the holidays, as I could save money instead of going back home. So I remained there, and I worked at various things. We were asked to do certain things, and I took it pretty slow as I tried to do my best with what work I had.
Very interesting. Go ahead.
After the holiday, I found quite a change in the program. We had began a lot of practical work with our hands, and I was quite at home. And the instruments that I used, I felt I was quite well acquainted with them. And it wasn't long until I began to like the idea. And I continued to try to accomplish the most and to acquaint myself with matters so I could meet the state board. I had made up my mind that I would take a try at the Oklahoma State Board. And I did and was registered to practice. Coming to Perry, I looked about for an office and found one had been vacated 2 or 3 weeks previous. It was occupied by a young man who came from Holton, Kansas. He decided to return to Holton, and he closed out his office. I took over the rooms and put my ad in the paper and opened my office. I was a very youthful-looking chap, and many came and interviewed me to get an idea whether they were sure that I did know what I was talking about. But I seemed to convince them, and from that time on I had no trouble. It was not long until there was more to do than I could get done. There was a young man from New York in Perry who came to obtain a divorce, and he came and assisted me in the office and helped me do many things. I decided that he would be a valuable asset to the office if I'd send him to Kansas City to school, which I did. But I sent him there for the full term, and he graduated. But I found after he had graduated, he was less attractive than he was before. And I told him that he'd better make arrangements to have an office of his own. He opened an office in Walters, Oklahoma, and it was not long until he burned out, and he called me over the phone and told me of his situation, and he asked me to send him an overcoat. Even his overcoat had burned, and it was cold weather. He returned to Perry for a little while, and then he found an office in Kay County, Oklahoma. I continued my practice and had my brother, who had decided to become a dentist, come during his vacation and assist me during the time. And he returned the following year to Kansas City for his second year. His third year, he went to Baltimore, Maryland, and completed his course and graduated from the Baltimore College. He had intended to remain with me, but I had decided that he should have an office of his own, and so he began looking around, and he went down southwest Oklahoma for a time, and then returned to Perry, and from Perry to Oklahoma City. I was quite content, but after becoming accustomed to having an assistant in the office, one is helpless without them, and I always needed an assistant. And I had various ones. Shut it off. And
Now there.
it was in May 1896 that I opened my office and began the practice of dentistry. I became acquainted with many of the citizens of Perry and was fortunate in my associations. Some of them speculated on how long I would stay, and others felt sorry for me, but I managed to get along. There were many here who were very desirable people, and it was no trouble to find someone to talk to who could carry on a good conversation and tell you many things in as good language as anyone used. Wait a minute, stop it. And during the coming few years, many things happened, and many of my good friends in Perry moved to Oklahoma City. Among them was Charles Colcord, E.E. Westervelt, John Noble, E.D. Nims, Arthur Wharton, and many others who were in business, young Davis and younger, in the horse and mule business. Perry had an established horse and mule business, second to none in the state, but they decided to take it to Oklahoma City. Charlie Colcord one day met me on the street and he says, "Come on, Doc, and go along. We're going to make her a city." But I just was afraid I'd starve to death down there, so I remained in Perry. And shut it off. David McKinstry moved to Oklahoma City and turned his mill over to the boys that were operating it. It was acquired by the General Mills, and they tore the mill down because there was an argument over taxes. That's the truth.
Go ahead.
After coming to Perry, I began. Soon after coming to Perry, I became acquainted with Henry S. Johnston, and the friendship continued down through the years until his death. I never found occasion to change my opinion of the governor. He was always, in my opinion, one of the best men I ever met. Now, there have been many other men that I wish I could tell about, but the space is too short. I think the friendships that I had here would be difficult to equal them any place. I found very fine characters, and every effort has always been made to maintain the town, the schools, and to spend what money we had so that it would accomplish something. And it looks now as though Perry had arrived. And from the things, some of our old buildings are being torn down and new ones will replace them. and there are many other signs of improvement. The churches are all represented with splendid edifices, and the school has as fine a school building as can be purchased. Perry maintains a good band, the school band. At present, they are in Chicago, and they have made various trips and contributed in various exhibitions.
Thank you, Dr. Seids, for this most interesting reminiscent talk, covering a space of 80 years. And we do appreciate your giving us this interview, and it will be a permanent part of the Living Legend Library at the Oklahoma Christian College, Eastern, at Memorial Road in Oklahoma City. And any of your friends who wish to hear this are invited to come down and put on the earphones and listen to the recording. Thank you very kindly, Dr. Seids.